This is Joe Barzicki with the Dell Solution Center. Today I'm going to show you Active Fabric Manager. During this video demonstration, I'm going to show you how you can design a fabric, pre-deploy a fabric, and go through and deploy a fabric as well as validate once everything is done. And today I'm really excited to show you a fabric that is capable of supporting 14 S6000s, which I just so happen to have here in our Chicago Solution Center. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is design the fabric. Everything is completely wizard driven, so we'll work through this rather quickly and get this fabric up and running as quickly as possible. This fabric name, since I know I already have all the S6000s, I'm just going to call it S6000. And this is going to be an extra large two-tier fabric using S6000. Remember, uplink bandwidth is going to be connections that flow outside the fabric. So think of these uplinks as a router, another multi-layer switch, perhaps a firewall for outside access. In this case, I'm going to use 40 gig. And my downlink bandwidth, this is going to be my access ports. In this case, I'm going to also use 40 gig. I'm going to go ahead and keep the number of uplink ports to 2. We can always scale this out later. And the number of downlink ports, I'm going to use 360. Since I have 14 S6000s right now, the number of access ports is going to be right around 360. And that'll get me 12 access switches and then 2 aggregation switches. And that's what I'm shooting for here in this fabric. I'm going to go ahead and select the fabric type to be layer 3 with resiliency. The deployment type, notice here I can choose between different products. I have Z9000s, and with 2.0, we now have the ability to support S6000s. Since I only have a limited number of cables, I'm going to go ahead and keep the S6000 basic design. Notice here if I want to upgrade or expand this fabric, I can do so as long as I stay within 870 downlink ports. So this looks good. As far as the fabric customization is concerned, this is going to show you exactly what the design is going to be for this fabric. I'm going to have 2 aggregation switches, and I'm going to have 12 access switches. Here's a quick glance at what the wiring is going to look like. I'm going to be interested in the tabular view, and I'm going to go ahead and export this to a PDF file. So this automatically does my documentation as well. Here's a quick view of that document that I just exported. And here's the wiring plan. Notice the fabric name is called S6000. We're going to have 2 uplinks, 360 downlinks. We're going to have 24 interconnects between the aggregation layer and the access layer. And here's the wiring plan. So this is really nice because it tells me exactly what port I need to cable up, connecting the access layer and the aggregation layer. And I'll quickly pan through this so you can pause the video if you want to get more specifics. Here's a visual representation of each S6000. As you can see, this is an incredibly powerful way to document a CLOS architecture. And when you start thinking about the number of switches that we can support, now with 2.0, we can do a 3-tier architecture. You can see the cabling can get rather complicated, and you're going to use a tool like this to simplify the deployment. A quick summary of my fabric. In the aggregation layer, I'm going to have 2 S6000s. In the access layer, I'm going to have 12 S6000s. I'm going to have 2 connections reserved for VLT. This is going to be in the aggregation layer. I went ahead and opted out for VLT in the access layer because I didn't have the number of cables here in the Solution Center today. So here's a cable suggestion. And the number of cables I'm going to need is going to be 28 total cables. I can choose copper or fiber. It also tells you the number of QSFP modules, which in this case is going to be 54. Okay, so that wraps up step 1 in designing the fabric. Now that I've gone through and designed this new fabric called S6000, I was able to go through and unbox each switch and then take advantage of the ready rails that S6000 has. It goes with a toolless design to rack the equipment. In addition to racking the equipment, I also cabled it up based on this wiring plan. And during the deployment phase, we'll also go in and validate that everything is wired correctly, which I certainly hope is the case. Now that we have the design in place, we have the physical topology, we also have the S6000s racked and cabled. Now we're going to go in and start putting in the logical configuration. This is going to take place during the pre-deployment phase. So let's get started. Notice here in step 2, we have the pre-deployment configuration. I'm going to go ahead and edit the fabric name called S6000. Now remember, Active Fabric Manager functions on bare metal provisioning, DHCP, and TFTP. And the combination of those 3 features, as well as some of the information that we'll key in here during pre-deployment, will allow us to quickly go through and deploy the fabric. First, it's going to ask me the loopback IP address. I'm going to go ahead and pick out a range that I've already allocated for every single one of our switches. Remember, during the design phase, we went ahead and pre-allocated 2 ports. Those ports are going to be port 120 on each S6000 in the aggregation layer that's going to uplink to something else. This could be a connection to a firewall, another multi-layer switch. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and say that I have an OSPF configuration. And I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of one particular network range that I've already pre-allocated and worked with my network engineers on. Now, as far as VLT configuration is concerned, I can now, in 2.0, add a range of VLANs, add one specific VLAN. I can delete VLANs, and then I can use the autofill feature as well. I'm going to go ahead and start with a range. And the starting VLAN in this case is going to be 500. And I'm going to go ahead and add 50 VLANs. And I'm going to increment that by 1. And I'm going to use an IP range. And then every single one of these VLANs will just be a /24. There you go. In just less than a second, I went ahead and pre-populated 50 VLANs for me. All of them are going to have the resiliency that we're expecting in a layer 3 topology, as well as all the layer 2 configuration. So this looks good. I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. In 2.0, we've also added a port channel configuration. So for all of our downlinks, we may come across some instances where we want to create port channels. This can be going to a hypervisor, perhaps another set of virtual switches, 10 gig switches, 1 gig switches. Anything we need physically, we can go ahead and create a logical port channel now in 2.0. In this case, I don't have all those requirements just yet. Now, for downlink port configuration, I can now associate all the ports that I need at the access layer and whether or not those need to be a tagged VLAN or an untagged VLAN. And I can always revisit this step later. I'm going to go ahead and define the VLANs but not associate anything just yet, just for simplicity. This is a very important step where we assign switch identities. The switch identity is bound to the burned-in MAC address or system MAC address for each individual switch. While I was unboxing and racking all of the switches, I went ahead and wrote down the MAC address for every single device. And then I went ahead and took those MAC addresses and created a CSV file. Notice I have 14 switch identities. And I carefully went through and made sure that from top down, every single one of the S6000s matches up appropriately. Okay, there we go. For management IP, I went ahead and created an isolated management network just for Active Fabric Manager and these S6000s. Here's my configuration. So I went ahead and created interface VLAN 108 for all those S6000s. Here's the IP address, which will be my gateway. And then I went ahead and passed that down to my access layer for this management network. We'll come back to this configuration in a moment. Now I'm going to go ahead and key in that exact same network. I'm going to create a default management route. And then I'm going to go ahead and create the starting IP address for every single one of the switches. And since I have 14 switches to go through and key in, I don't really want to do that at once, so I'm just going to autofill. And let me just do a double check here, make sure everything's good. The method from which bare metal provisioning works uses DHCP, and it uses DHCP discover addresses, which I've indicated right here. I just happen to have a console connection here on one of the S6000s. And notice this switch is going through and just sending out DHCP discovers on every interface. SNMP and CLI credentials, I went ahead and pre-populated that when I deployed the virtual appliance. We can always use SSH later, but for simplicity, I just kept it at Telnet. Remember, Active Fabric Manager can manage multiple elements. In this case, since I'm using all S6000s, the operating system was already predefined for me. And I'm going to use TFTP to transfer that data. And since Active Fabric Manager is a TFTP/FTP server and a DHCP server, this is also another step where DHCP integration I really don't have to worry about right now. If I decided to use an external DHCP server, I can certainly do so and save this file and merge it with an existing DHCP configuration file. So we're taking advantage of DHCP. Bare metal provisioning is doing the phone home feature to Active Fabric Manager. Active Fabric Manager then responds with the appropriate information based on the hardware Ethernet address and that management IP to push a minimum configuration. Make sure that it has the standard operating system across the entire fabric. Notice the transfer files for TFTP is completed. And my uplink configuration, again, these are the connections that'll flow outside the fabric. So this is going to go to my router or my multi-layer switch, which I'm going to connect at 40 gig. Just one word of note, I do not have these physically cabled in this particular scenario, but I can always cable it up later. Here's my VLT configuration. And then here's my method of transport, which in this case will be TFTP. The site for my software is going to be Active Fabric Manager itself. And then the S6000 path, this is where the operating system is located. Going back to my configuration for that VLAN 108, I just have a standard VLAN with a standard IP address of 10.204.108.129/27. Now, since I'm going to traverse a layer 3 network for management, DHCP is going to require a helper address. So it's very simple for me to connect those two together by going in and creating a DHCP helper address. And in this case, my DHCP helper address will be Active Fabric Manager itself, because remember, he's also acting as a DHCP server. So I'm going to go ahead and add the helper address now. And now I'm going to go ahead and select Finish. And in 2.0, we've added some capabilities where we do some of that pre-deployment beforehand. In fact, I'm going to try and catch that information if possible. There we go. That happened very quickly, but across all 14 S6000s, since I've made that DHCP connection, it's now going to go through and accept the DHCP request, go in and start pulling down its minimum configuration and start the process to deploy this fabric. This wraps up step 2, pre-deployment configuration for 14 S6000s. In this video, I'm going to go through step 3, which is deploying the fabric. I've already gone through step 1 and step 2. Let's get started. In here, I have the option to deploy, and I also have the option to do advanced configuration. I'll come back to this a little bit later in another video. Let's go through and lay the foundation for our S6000 fabric, and it's very simple to do. I'm going to go ahead and select all 14 S6000s. And here you can see how easy it is to deploy it. I did not have to go into each individual switch and make any configuration changes. Everything is driven by Active Fabric Manager. Also during this process, it will also validate that every S6000 is wired up to the design that we specified earlier during the design phase. We went ahead and successfully deployed 14 S6000s. We can always add to this fabric later using advanced configuration by adding different templates. We can also go back during the pre-deployment phase and add additional VLANs, make changes to VLANs, modify the downstream ports, add additional port channels, all the different types of things that you would expect to do in a working environment you can do here, and it's all powered by Active Fabric Manager. Also, the validation was successfully completed. So after I went through and deployed the fabric, it'll also go through and make sure that all the physical connections meet the design specification that we did for this template. Notice down here we have 2 errors. Let's go take a look at what those errors are. And here are the errors. So I can always acknowledge these errors or clear them if needed. I purposely did not add the uplink connections. So that's why we have a couple of errors in the aggregation layer. There we go. That wraps up S6000 fabric.